In the year 1872, on the winding back roads of Delaware County, Pennsylvania, men began to vanish. They were drifters, veterans, freedmen, and immigrants, walking the fields in search of work after the Civil War. Most were nameless to history, their disappearance explained away as wandering west. But hidden in the cellar of a farmstead, sealed in a box of ledgers, another story waited. The Henderson family appeared to be pillars of the community. Church-going, industrious, praised in Sunday bulletins as models of Christian charity. Yet their records tell a different story. Names entered in spring, wages partially paid, then struck through with a single word: void. Dozens of men were erased not by departure, but by design. And the deeper one looks, the darker it becomes. Henderson's fields filled with misnumbered graves, sheriffs and pastors marked as paid or silent. And at the center of it all, a family who managed their image so carefully that even as they buried farmhands under false names, they clipped newspaper articles praising their generosity. This is not folklore. This is an archive of murder preserved in ink and silence, where respectability became camouflage, and the churchyard smile of a family concealed the systematic erasure of men whose lives no one thought worth counting. You're watching the Macabre Record. Before we open the Henderson ledgers, subscribe and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Because what you're about to hear is one of America's darkest buried truths. The Henderson family, a forgotten archive of murdered farmhands. The year 1872 was meant to mark a new stability in the Pennsylvania Valley. But the roads told another story. They were lined with men moving on foot, their boots worn down, their coats frayed, their eyes fixed not on destinations, but on the possibility of work. Some courtiers ride union discharge papers folded into rotting satchels. Others carried nothing at all. They were veterans without pensions. Freed men turned away from towns unwilling to employ them. Immigrants who had arrived with promise, but found only the long miles of farmland stretching into silence. These men had no property, no votes in many counties, no advocates. They lived on the margins of every census and account book. They existed only when they were needed, when hands were required for harvest, for clearing stumps, or for laying new fence lines. A day's pay might be recorded. A name might be noted on a scrap of paper. Then they slipped back into the stream of bodies passing through Pennsylvania's interior roads. They were, in the eyes of the institutions meant to count them, expendable. The war had reshaped the nation, but left behind its human debris. Soldiers had learned to march. Now they marched without orders. Freedmen carried scars from both chains and rifles. Now they carried the weight of laws that had freed them in name, but not in fact. The Irish and German immigrants who had filled the ranks of regiments found themselves shunned when the demand for sacrifice ended. Each group converged on the same farm roads, reduced to the same condition. Men without roots. Farmers could hire them cheaply, house them in lofts or sheds, and dismiss them without consequence. No parish tracked their attendance. No courthouse held their testimony. They were, as one county clerk later described in a margin note, men who disappear. Hunger made them pliant, loneliness made them silent, and a culture that measured worth in land ownership rendered them invisible. This invisibility was not incidental, it was structural. Newspapers rarely reported a missing farmhand. Sheriffs were not dispatched when a drifter failed to appear in town. Death, when it came to such men, was often misfiled as departure, and so Pennsylvania's fields became not only places of growth, but of quiet subtraction. What makes this road so haunting is not only that so many walked it, but that so many left no trace of where it ended. A brother gone west, a cousin never heard from again, a soldier who did not return home, but also did not return to the regiment's roll call. These became common refrains in letters of the early 1870s. Loss was explained away by distance, but the distance was sometimes measured not in miles, but in soil. Into this landscape, certain farms acquired reputations whispered among the laboring men. Some places were known for fair pay, others for brutal conditions. One farm in particular, the Henderson homestead of Delaware County, stood apart. It offered wages, lodging, and the illusion of stability. But the ledgers preserved from that farm suggest another pattern entirely. The Henderson farm was not merely a stop along the Drifters' Road. It was an end to it. In the heart of Delaware County, Pennsylvania, the Henderson name carried weight. It was a name spoken in church pews, written in county fair programs, and listed among the donors who contributed to the rebuilding of barns after storms. They were not wealthy in the way of industrialists, but theirs was the steady wealth of land, broad, fertile acres of corn and wheat fields, with livestock fenced in pastures that rolled toward the horizon. Their holdings placed them among the county's larger landowners, and that status carried both visibility and respect. The Henderson family was industrious and punctual in their observances. The patriarch attended Sunday service without fail, his wife organizing church suppers, their children noted for their neat appearance in school registers. They tithed predictably, appeared in ledgers of civic contributions, and were named in local accounts as models of agricultural virtue. For those who met them in town, the impression was consistent: a God-fearing, hard-working family who kept to their land and did not court scandal. Their farmstead reflected this image. The central house, built of timber and whitewashed to brightness, stood at the crown of a low hill. Outbuildings stretched in practical lines behind it: barns, stables, a granary. The place suggested order, permanence, and hospitality. Laborers arriving from the road would see beds of hay in the loft, smoke rising from the chimney, and a family willing to pay wages on time. For men who had been turned away from other farms or cheated out of earnings, the Henderson offered what appeared to be certainty. The certainty was reinforced by record-keeping. The Henderson were meticulous in their accounts: wages tallied, contracts written, supplies tracked with an almost bureaucratic neatness. To county officials, this suggested integrity. To the transient laborers, it suggested legitimacy. The farm seemed a rare anchor in a world that offered little stability. Neighbors admired their efficiency. Townspeople pointed to their good standing in commerce. They were not remembered for quarrels, nor for debt, nor for mistreatment of neighbors. They were remembered for predictability, an image carefully curated, though no one at the time thought to use the word. In a landscape of shifting labor and ruthless men, the Henderson projected permanence. But permanence can conceal. Respectability can serve as its own disguise. The same ledgers that neighbors admired would later become a source of dread. The same loft that offered straw beds to weary men would decades later reveal what those men had truly left behind. The Henderson reputation was their shield, but it was more than that. It was their camouflage. And only when a box of records was discovered in the cellar of their farmhouse decades after their deaths did the outlines of that disguise begin to dissolve. In the summer of 1928, the Henderson farm, long since abandoned, its last heir, having died without children, was being prepared for auction. The farmhouse had stood for more than half a century, its timbers warped but unbroken, its cellar thick with dust and cobwebs. When workmen descended into the cellar to clear the space, they pried open a narrow cavity behind a supporting wall and found a box wedged inside. The lid was nailed shut, the wood dry and splintering. Inside was not what one expects to find on a farm. No tools, no family keepsakes, no hidden coins. Instead there was paper, stacks of ledgers, contracts and loos, slips bound with string. The handwriting was steady, businesslike, consistent. The ink had browned with age, but the lines remained legible, preserved by the cellar's dryness. Each volume bore the careful neatness of accounts, but the accounts themselves told a story that resisted order. At first glance, the ledgers appeared to be payroll records. Each entry listed a name, a date of hire, the wages promised, and notations of advances for food or clothing. The writing suggested diligence, an almost bureaucratic obsession with detail, but then patterns emerged. Rows of names trailed off into silence. Some were crossed through with thick lines. Others were stamped with a word that recurred again and again: void. There were no receipts for dismissal, no signatures of final payment. Instead, there were abrupt endings. A man might be listed as owing 2 weeks of work, only for the account to stop mid-page. Another might have his name circled, then erased beneath a diagonal slash. The handwriting, neat and restrained, grew more chilling with each turn of the page. It was not the ledger of crops sold or debts paid. It was a tally of disappearances. Contracts folded into the backs of these books told the same story. Promises of room and board, daily wages, and steady work were signed by the hands of transient men, signatures that survive nowhere else, but most contracts ended without closure. They were cut short, unsigned at the bottom, or amended with a final notation that seemed to erase the labourer from record. What unnerved the archivists who later examined the box was not only what was recorded, but what was missing. No discharge notes, no forwarding addresses, no explanations of departure. The ledgers functioned as beginnings without endings, as if the men had been folded into the farm and never released. The box was resealed and transferred to county storage, where its significance deepened with each attempt to cross-reference the names. For many, the Henderson records are the only trace they ever left. No census lines, no gravestones, only an entry in a ledger followed by its abrupt cancellation. The Henderson farm had appeared to neighbours as orderly, respectable, even godly. But the papers pulled from its cellar suggested a different truth. They were not keeping books of crops. They were keeping books of men and of vanishings. The Henderson archive does not reveal its crimes through confession. It reveals them through interruption. Each ledger entry begins in the ordinary manner of farm accounts. A name written with steady hand, a date of hire, a daily wage agreed upon, 25 cents, sometimes 35 plus board. For some, a small advance was noted, a pair of boots, a shirt, tobacco, the neat arithmetic of life on the margins. But where a balance should close, where signatures should confirm discharge, there is only absence. A heavy line struck through the name, a diagonal mark bisecting the page, the word void written in capital letters, darker and heavier than the rest. Take the case of William Murphy, age Reg. Corded as 21, hired in June. He was given an advance of $1.50 and a set of work clothes. The ledger tracks him through midsummer, wages accruing to nearly $6. Then silence, no closing sum, no release. His name ends in a slash of ink, the word void stamped beside it. His parents, writing from Philadelphia in 1875, asked after him in a letter preserved in a different county archive. The sheriff's reply was brief. No record. Another entry, Michael O'Brien, a veteran of the 118th Pennsylvania Infantry. He signed for wages in April, and his contract still folded in the ledger carries his uneven hand. Advances included a shovel and tobacco. His balance reached $4 before the entry stopped. Void. No pension filings survive under his name, though comrades recalled he had spoken of finding steady farm work. He was never mentioned again in regiment reunions. The handwriting is consistent, the diagonal lines cut with deliberation, not haste. Each erasure is precise, as though following procedure, and yet in testimony collected decades later, families recounted the same pattern. A son last seen walking south toward the Henderson farm, a cousin who wrote once from Delaware County, but never again, a brother who took day wages in spring and was not at home by harvest. The Henderson records provide a skeleton where memory provides flesh. Men arriving in early summer strong and willing, accounts built week by week, a sudden stop in late August or September, then nothing. In each case, the disappearance mirrored the rhythm of the soil hired when crops demanded labor, erased when the work was done. Neighbors might have assumed these men simply moved on, as so many did. Families farther away were told the same story by county clerks. The laborers were drifters, untraceable. Yet the archive tells otherwise. They did not drift. They were marked, recorded, and then struck from the page with cold precision. The void was not just ink, it was the administrative form of erasure itself. Lives turned into blank space, families left to search against silence. And as the ledgers piled up, the pattern hardened into routine, a cycle that repeated itself each season. The Henderson archive does not present its violence as spectacle. It presents it as rhythm. When the ledgers are examined side by side, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Each spring, as the soil warmed and fields demanded labor, the Henderson recorded new names, young men from the road, hired on terms that promised weeks of steady work. Each entry began cleanly, with wages agreed upon, advances noted, and marks of labor rendered. By midsummer, the pages thickened with small debts, tobacco, soap, a pair of work gloves. The arithmetic grew heavier as hours were tallied against these advances, but as autumn approached, a familiar silence descended. Accounts stopped mid-line. Names were crossed through. The diagonal mark returned, the word void recurring with unnerving regularity. Then, in spring, the cycle began again. Fresh names written beneath the last, as though replacing seeds in a field. The repetition is its own kind of cruelty. It suggests that the disappearances were not incident, not sudden, not accidental, they were scheduled. The killings, or whatever final act void truly represented, aligned not with human conflict, but with agricultural necessity. Men were useful in May, disposable by September. Violence here was not passion, but procedure folded into the cadence of the harvest. One detail underscores this chilling regularity. Beside some entries, a single notation appears. Replace. These notes, written in the same hand that crossed out the name, signal that the disappearance of one worker was immediately followed by the acquisition of another. The Henderson did not conceal their substitutions, they documented them. Each life was a line item to be erased and replaced, as though nothing more than a broken tool. For the men themselves, this cycle was invisible. Each believed he had found steady work. Each saw the fields stretching ahead of him, the barns full of grain, the promise of pay at season's end. But in the Henderson books, he was already numbered among those destined to vanish. His name was a placeholder until the time came to void it. The effect on the reader of these records is not shock, but suffocation. Turning page after page, one sees not individual crimes, but repetition. Vanishing stacked atop vanishings, routine swallowing anomaly. Violence stripped of drama, violence made bureaucratic. It is this monotony that unsettles most, the recognition that erasure had become, for the Henderson, just another seasonal chore. And yet, among these coldly mechanical entries, another hand begins to appear. A second set of markings, smaller and more clinical, surfaces in the margins, notes not of wages, but of bodies, observations of appetite, sleep, and weakness. They read less like farm accounts than medical surveillance, as if someone in the household had begun recording the men not as workers, but as subjects. The overseer's hand emerges here, tracing decline in the margins, documenting lives on the brink of being voided. The main body of the Henderson ledgers is predictable. Wages, advances, balances, struck cleanly through with the word void. But at irregular intervals, another voice intrudes in smaller script written at angles along the margins, appear brief clinical notes. The handwriting is different, narrower, more deliberate, without the steady symmetry of the main accounts. These marginalia are not financial, they are observational. A name is written in the ledger. A week's labor tallied beside it, faintly one finds ate little. Another line complains of sleep. A third weakened. The phrases are stripped of empathy, reduced to physiological condition. They carry the tone of medical notes, as if the men were no longer considered laborers, but specimens under study. The shift in voice is jarring. Where the main ledger portrays routine commerce, the overseer's hand catalogues decline. A body faltering from hunger, a man unable to rest, a worker growing thin. The marks suggest not simple record-keeping but surveillance. The quiet monitoring of men as they moved from vitality to exhaustion. The notes accumulate over pages. One labourer's entry is accompanied by a sequence. 8 little stomach pain. Vomiting. Weeks later, the word void cuts through his name. Another's progress is charted as though in a case file. Steady at first, weakened mid-August, persistent cough. Again, the abrupt slash. The overseer's words do not extend beyond observation. No remedies are noted, no intervention suggested. The men were documented in their decline, then erased when the decline ended in disappearance. It is the detachment that unsettles. These marginal notes imply an active watcher, someone present enough to record daily conditions, but absent enough to offer nothing but a line of ink. To the overseer, hunger and weakness were not warning signs to prevent loss of labour. They were data points, to be logged before the inevitable cancellation. Historians who examined these margins struggled with their meaning. Were the notes kept by a family member with medical training, by an overseer tasked not only with labour, but with monitoring? Or were they evidence of a colder motive, a deliberate cataloguing of men on the brink of disposal? The ambiguity itself is disturbing. In contrast to the ledger's mechanical accounting, the overseer's notes draw the men momentarily into focus, not as people, but as bodies in decline. They are given detail, but not dignity. This is not remembrance. It is recording before erasure. And when those names vanish from the page, questions follow. Where did these men go? What became of the weakened bodies so carefully described? The archive itself does not answer, but in Delaware County's Potter's Fields, misnumbered graves and mismatched initials begin to align with the voids left in the Henderson books. Someone was not only voiding men from the ledgers, someone was burying them in silence. Delaware County's Potter's Fields were not meant to hold secrets. They were meant to hold the poor, the unclaimed, the nameless, whose families could not afford a burial plot. Rows of wooden markers once stood there, each with a number rather than a name, but time has reduced them to stubs of rot and soil. What endures are the burial registers, thin volumes kept by county clerk, noting the dead as little more than expenses. Coffin provided, burial completed, cost reimbursed. When historians began to cross-reference these registers with the Henderson archive, faint correspondences surfaced. A man's initials in the ledger WM, voided in August 1873, matched a potter's grave labelled William Malone Drifter. Yet no census nor tax record shows a man of that name in Delaware. Another recorded as M.O. in the Henderson book corresponds to a potter's entry for Michael O'Connor, a surname never again found in the Sears. Until the pattern recurs, initials aligning with misnamed dead, identities subtly altered, as though burial itself had been staged under false headings. Exhumations conducted in the 1930s, when parts of the field were disturbed for roadworks, deepened the suspicion. Some graves were shallower than regulations required, bones less than a foot below the surface. Skeletal remains showed anomalies inconsistent with natural death. Skulls fractured, ribs splintered, femur snapped by blunt force. One coroner's report, long forgotten in county files, describes multiple contusions to the cranium, likely pre-mortem. The dead were not merely buried poor, they were buried prematurely. Other details pointed to deliberate mislabeling. Wooden markers were reused, numbers overwritten, the same grave listed twice with different entries. Clerks appear to have accepted these irregularities without protest. In one case, the burial register notes a payment to the sheriff for conveyance of deceased labourer. The name written only as unknown. The timing coincides with a voided entry in the Henderson ledger. The field itself has become a map of erasure. Misnumbered graves align with missing men. Initials echoing through falsified names. Where the ledgers fall silent, the soil speaks through faintly. The cycle traced on paper, hired, observed, voided, finds its final form here in shallow pits, disguised as potters' graves. Yet the question persists, how could such substitutions have gone unchallenged? Why did no coroner object, no pastor question the burials of so many nameless men? The answer lies not in the soil, but in the margins of the Henderson archive itself, where brief notations accompany certain voided names, notes that do not describe labor or hunger, but silence bought and silence kept. Sheriff paid, pastor silent. The farmhands were not lost. They were planted in silence, and that silence was shared. Among the Henderson papers, the ledgers are not uniform. Most entries are written in the same steady hand, but scattered through the volumes are notations in a different script, sharper, less practiced, as though added quickly in the margins. These notes stand apart from wages and balances. They are brief but unmistakable. Besides certain voided names appear the words, "Sheriff paid," on others, "Pastor silent." The implications are direct. The Henderson were not acting in isolation. They were paying for silence. One example survives from 1874. A farmhand listed as PJ is voided after only 2 weeks of work. The entry should have ended there, but instead a faint set of initials appears alongside the word paid. Those initials match the name of Delaware County Sheriff at the time, who held office until 1877. The handwriting is not the Henderson patriarch's. It is distinct, perhaps that of a clerk or overseer tasked with recording proof of the transaction. The sheriff himself would later report no missing men in that year. Another ledger page dated 1876 bears the words Pasto, R silent. The name voided is R. Brennan, a laborer signed on in May, erased by July. The note suggests not only awareness, but complicity from the local church. Silence here was not passive. It was arranged. Sermons continued, contributions accepted, and the Henderson family remained pillars of their congregation. The disappearance of Brennan was never mentioned from the pulpit. The repetition of such notes cannot be dismissed as coincidence. More than a dozen voided names are paired with notations of payments or assurances. The initials correspond to officials who held positions in Delaware at the time, clerk, sheriffs, even a deputy judge. None left official records of disappearances. All maintained the appearance of order. This collusion reveals how the Henderson were able to continue year after year, but without suspicion. The system itself was pliable. Lawmen who might have investigated were compensated. Pastors who might have raised moral alarm kept still. The machinery of community designed to protect its weakest members was quietly inverted, ensuring those men remained unprotected. Historians note that this was not unusual in the rural northeast of the late 19th century. Migrant workers were rarely defended, and officials often relied on landowning families for political support. But what distinguishes the Henderson archive is its evidence. The silence was not abstract. It was written down line by line in the margins of a family's own records. The archive shows that these men were not simply forgotten. They were deliberately erased, and their erasure purchased. Respectability is difficult to pierce when law and church alike are invested in maintaining it. For decades, the Henderson family moved easily through Delaware County life. Admired in newspapers, praised in church bulletins, their reputation untarnished. The family did not act alone. Their silence was purchased. And with that purchased silence, the Henderson turned their public image into a shield so polished that even the press reflected it. If the ledgers revealed what the Henderson family erased, the clippings reveal what they preserved. Tucked between contracts and voided names were newspaper cuttings folded with care, their edges browned with age. The pieces were brief. Announcements of donations to church repairs, mentions of hospitality offered to visiting clergy, notices of contributions to county fairs. Each article was marked in pencil, as if the family had wanted to ensure the lines praising them would not be lost. The local press spoke warmly of the Henderson. An 1875 bulletin praised them for hosting a Sunday gathering of parishioners, describing their farmstead as a place of Christian welcome and abundance. Another clipping from the county paper in 1877 referred to the patriarch as a man of upright character, generous with his neighbors, and firm in his faith. These were the words the community read. These were the images the Henderson clipped, saved, and filed. The contrast witted. The ledgers could not be sharper. On the same pages where contracts ended in void, a separate envelope contained notices of the family's visible virtue. Men vanished in silence while their employers smiled from printed columns, their respectability reinforced not by truth, but by repetition. The archive does not explain why these clippings were preserved, only that they were collected. But their presence beside the records of disappearance suggests an obsession with appearances, a need to hold both accounts together, one for the community, one for themselves. Portraits published in these papers confirm the image. The Henderson posed stiffly for daguerreotypes, later reproduced in ink. The father stern, the mother composed, the children arranged neatly, all clothed in the plain dignity of rural respectability. These images were paired with articles about their devotion to church and service to the community. They projected stability in a world unsettled by war and migration. For neighbors, this made them a family to trust. For the drifters on the road, it made their farm seem safe. But the ledgers and the clippings placed together in the same box tell another story. Each page of public kindness rests against a page of private erasure. Each smiling notice is shadowed by a voided name. The juxtaposition feels deliberate, as if the Henderson required both mirrors to maintain balance, the outward reflection of charity, the inward ledger of cruelty. This careful preservation of image underscores a deeper truth. Violence did not disrupt their respectability. It reinforced it. By eliminating the nameless and replacing them each season, the Henderson kept their farm productive, their reputation intact, their status in church secure. The archive becomes not only a record of crime, but a study in control of how image could be weaponized to conceal routine disappearance. And yet, within this duality, a shift appears alongside the clipped articles and voided names. The overseer's marginal hand, the one that noted weakness, hunger, decline, abruptly vanishes from the record. His final notes fall silent. The main ledger continues, but the watching eye is gone. The Henderson farm was a mirror, kindness reflected outward, cruelty contained within, and now one of the mirrors had cracked. Through the years 1872 and 1873, the overseer's marginal notes run like a parallel script beside the Henderson accounts. Small observations ate little, complaints of sleep, weakened, etched the worker's decline in a tone at once detached and precise. It is a voice distinct from the ledger's cold arithmetic, a secondary record of men as bodies rather than balances. But in the autumn of 1874, that voice vanishes. The break is abrupt. Pages that once bore two hands now bear only one. Where marginalia once traced appetite and illness, only wages and voids remain. The diagonal slashes persist, but the watchful comments are gone. The men vanish as before, yet the human detail, the fate and trace of their suffering disappears with them. This silence changes the tone of the archive. Without the overseer's hand, the ledgers become colder, more mechanical. Entries that once contained fragments of humanity, however clinical, are stripped down to transaction alone. A name, a balance, a line struck through, nothing more. The book becomes a machine of erasure, with no acknowledgement that men had lived between the numbers. Why did the overseer's notes stop? The archive offers no answer, but the absence itself is suggestive. Did the Henderson dismiss him? Did he object to what he had been recording, or was he too voided? His hand vanishes precisely when other voids are marked. No discharge, no replacement, no transfer of duty is noted, only the silence where a second script had been. Some scholars interpret the absence as conflict within the household, a participant unwilling to continue, erased like the others. Others argue the overseer may have been complicit to a point, then removed when his record-keeping risked exposure. Whatever the cause, the loss of marginal notes signals not moderation, but intensification. After 1874, the ledgers carry no trace of hesitation. They move with efficiency, reducing each life to a line crossed, each worker to a unit replaced. The disappearance of the overseer's voice underscores a deeper cruelty. His detached observations, though clinical, at least acknowledged the men's deterioration. Without them, the archive reads, as though these men had never eaten, never weakened, never existed. They are hired, voided, and replaced with no intermediate state. The watcher's silence completes their erasure. And yet, outside the Henderson farm, fragments of rumor persist. In oral accounts collected decades later, whispers surface of men who fled Delaware, having worked briefly for the Henderson before vanishing into other counties. They did not testify, did not accuse, did not leave written trace. They lived, but they did not speak. Survival itself seemed bound to silence. Not every man who crossed the Henderson threshold was erased. Among the fragments of testimony collected decades later, faint traces suggest that some survived, but their survival was shadowed, never spoken of in full, their accounts carried only in rumor and second-hand recollection. In the 1880s, a farm wife in neighboring Chester County recalled a laborer who stayed one season, refused to give his name, and left behind only a phrase repeated whenever turned to work. Don't go to Delaware. Another account preserved in a family letter tells of a veteran who appeared at a reunion in Philadelphia with scars across his scalp, speaking briefly of a farm where men went missing before falling silent. These glimpses are not testimony. They are fragments scattered and unverifiable, but together they point toward the possibility of escape. The men who fled the Henderson farm never entered official records. No depositions, no sworn statements, no court proceedings preserve their voices. Their absence from the archive is as complete as the absence of those who never returned. And yet the very fact of their silence may be its own form of testimony. In communities where oral accounts lingered, the Henderson farm became a whispered warning. Among drifters it was said quietly around campfires, the farm where men vanished. Such phrases carried the weight of fear, but never reached the ears of lawmen. For transient workers, speaking too openly was dangerous. To accuse a family of stature supported by church and sheriff alike was to risk being branded a liar, or to risk being erased in turn. Silence in that world was protection. But silence can also be evidence of trauma. The few who may have fled seemed unable or unwilling to recount what they had seen. Their muteness suggests coercion or experiences too brutal to articulate. In one chilling account, a tavern keeper remembered a stranger who muttered only, "They keep books but not of crops," before refusing to explain further. He left the tavern before dawn, never to return. The Henderson archive, for all its precision, leaves space for these shadows. Men listed briefly, voided suddenly, who reappear in rumor across county lines. If they lived, they carried with them an unspoken burden, the knowledge of what had transpired, locked within silence. The result is paradoxical, survival that feels as erased as death. Historians have argued that these silences may be the strongest indictment. The absence of testimony is not proof of nothing. It is proof of a system in which testimony was impossible. Fear, power, and complicity closed every door a survivor might have opened. And in the face of such silence, the Henderson found another method to strengthen erasure. Beyond voiding names, they falsified the records themselves, manufacturing evidence that wages had been paid, that contracts had been fulfilled, that men had walked away voluntarily. If the Henderson archive is a record of erasure, it is also a record of invention. The ledgers do not merely strike through names or stamp them void. In many places they go further, fabricating the illusion that men had completed their work, received their wages, and left of their own accord. It is disappearance disguised as departure. Later analysis of the ledgers revealed anomalies that betrayed the deception. Payments were entered in neat sums, rounded to whole dollars, unlike the usual fractional wages that reflected daily work. These closing balances often appeared abruptly, written in heavier ink, sometimes even in a different hand. Cross-checking against bank and supply records showed no withdrawals, no transactions to match the supposed payments. The money never changed hands. The ledger was not balancing accounts. It was manufacturing alibis. Even more telling were the signatures. Several contracts preserved in the archive bear final notations that seem to confirm discharge. Scrolled names in unfamiliar script meant to represent the departing worker. But handwriting comparisons reveal they do not match the men's original signatures at the start of the contracts. Instead, they resemble imitations, shaky approximations added later, often on different paper stock. In some cases, the supposed signature is identical across multiple entries, copied again and again as proof of voluntary exit. This falsification served a precise function. It created the appearance of closure, a paper trail that absolved the Henderson family of suspicion. If a question arose about a missing hand, the ledger could be shown. Here is his wage. Here is his signature. Here is the proof he left freely. What the books really display is the bureaucratic laundering of lives. Disappearance made indistinguishable from normal turnover. The psychological effect is disturbing. The ledgers do not only record absence, they overwrite presence. They transform the unwillingly vanished into men who seem to have chosen departure. In this way, the crime is doubled. The body is taken, and the story of that body is replaced with a forgery. Silence becomes not an accident of history, but an intentional construction. It is easy to imagine how effective this deception would have been. Migrant laborers were expected to drift. A forged signature or false note of payment confirmed what the community already assumed, that men moved on without word. Suspicion dissolved beneath the weight of paperwork. The Henderson did not simply erase men. They manufactured proof those men had never truly stayed. And yet, this archive of deception itself nearly vanished. After the farm's abandonment, the box of ledgers was misfiled, labeled only as routine farm accounts, its significance ignored for decades. It sat in county storage, buried under layers of dust and neglect, close to being lost entirely until accident brought it back to light. The Henderson archive, the only surviving witness to what happened on that farm, was almost lost a second time. After the family line ended, their property sold and their barns collapsed into ruin. The box of ledgers and contracts was collected with other household remnants during a county clean-out. The papers were bundled with receipts, seed catalogues and farm calendars, then transferred into storage at the Delaware County courthouse. The box was given no distinction. On its lid, a clerk scrolled a brief description in pencil. Farm account books. It was shelved among tax rolls and auction inventories in a back room where rodents gnawed through twine and mildew curled the edges of paper. For decades it remained there untouched, mistaken for the ordinary detritus of farm life. What preserved it was accident, not intention. In 1928, during a courthouse reorganization, a junior archivist began sorting neglected boxes to free space. The Henderson bundle was opened with little expectation. Inside, instead of routine crop accounts, he found a ledger whose entries ended not in balance, but in void. Contracts folded in the margins bore signatures of men never found in census lists. At first, the archivist assumed he had misunderstood. Perhaps these were unfinished drafts. But as he turned the pages, a pattern took shape. Men entered, men disappeared, and beside their erasures were notes not of crops or debts, but of silence arranged. Sheriff paid, pastor silent. The discovery stunned him. This was no farm account in the usual sense. It was something closer to an autopsy, performed on paper, preserved in ink. The archivist alerted his superiors, and the box was set aside for special review. But even then, its significance was slow to register. Only years later, when historians began to cross-reference the names, did the archive's true weight emerge. The missing, the mislabeled graves, the falsified payments, all had been hiding under the blandest of titles, farm account books. That label is its own kind of irony. For nearly half a century, the records of disappearance were themselves nearly erased, not by fire or deliberate destruction, but by neglect. A single stroke of bureaucratic shorthand, a single clerk's dismissal, nearly buried the truth in silence, as complete as the voided names within the books. The episode illustrates a deeper danger, how fragile evidence can be, and how easily atrocity hides in plain sight. Had the box been burned in a routine disposal of old farm papers, the Henderson story would have vanished entirely, leaving only whispers. The men marked void would have remained untraceable, their disappearance explained as drift, their fate buried in soil and silence. Even the archive was almost murdered by neglect, and its survival poses a larger question. Was the Henderson farm exceptional in its cruelty, or exceptional only in leaving its records behind? The Henderson archive, with its voided names and falsified accounts, is singular in its survival. But the pattern it reveals, the seasonal hiring, the sudden disappearances, the silence of officials, was not unique to Delaware County. Across Pennsylvania in the same decades, the historical record is dotted with vanishings that echo the same rhythm. In Lancaster County, letters from 1876 describe two brothers who set out to find work on farms and were never heard from again. Their family petitioned the sheriff, who dismissed the matter with the familiar phrase, "likely gone west." In Berks County, a church register lists a prayer request for those missing from the roads, written in a pastor's hand, never followed by names. Newspapers across the region occasionally noted disappearances of farm laborers, always explained away as transients. Few inquiries were pursued, no ledgers were kept. The pattern is unmistakable. Men arrived in spring, hired for planting and harvest, then were absent by autumn. The disappearance was explained by mobility, the constant movement of laborers across counties. But the Henderson archive shows how easily that assumption could be used to disguise violence if one farm reduced labor to a cycle of hire and void. How many others practiced the same without leaving paper behind? Historians examining census gaps and coroner's reports see shadows of a larger practice. Men whose names appear once in county documents, never again. Graves marked unknown laborer. The repetition across counties suggests that the Henderson were not innovators of cruelty, only meticulous recorders of it. Where others may have burned contracts, the Henderson filed them. Where others erased evidence, the Henderson preserved it in boxes mislabeled as ordinary accounts. This possibility unsettles the narrative. If the Henderson were singular, then their archive is a confession, a rare glimpse into a family's secret machinery of disappearance. If they were not, then the archive is not confession at all. It is template, a method repeated quietly across Pennsylvania, perhaps across the Northeast, wherever displaced men walk the roads hungry for wages and protection. The question is not whether the Henderson were crueler than their neighbors. It is whether they were only more careful in their bookkeeping. The survival of their ledgers may owe less to accident than to arrogance, a certainty that the silence of sheriffs and pastors would shield them indefinitely. That silence allowed the pattern to spread beyond Delaware, its traces visible only in the gaps where men should have been, the shallow graves where initials no longer match names. If so, the Henderson are not an anomaly. They are evidence of a practice that has otherwise disappeared with the records themselves. The Henderson archive may be less confession than template, and yet at the very end of its pages, the rhythm falters. The books do not close with balance, nor with resolution. They end abruptly with lines ruled neatly, waiting for names that were never written. The Henderson archive ends not with confession, nor with conclusion, but with silence carefully prepared. In the final volume, the pages are ruled in neat lines, margins measured with a ruler's edge, headings written out in advance, name, date hired, wages, balance. But beneath them, the spaces remain empty. Line after line stretches blank across the paper, waiting to be filled and never touched. This silence is not accidental. The care with which the columns are prepared suggests intention. Someone believed the work would continue. Someone prepared the book for names that were expected to come. The ledger does not close. It waits. The psychological weight of this blankness is heavier than the voids that came before. The earlier volumes, with their slashed names and stamped erasures, at least acknowledged presence before disappearance. Here, absence is institutionalized in advance. The blank lines carry the implication that men were already erased before they arrived, their fates predetermined by columns drawn to absorb them. The pages expose violence not as an interruption, but as a continuity. The farm's rhythm, hiring in spring, voiding by autumn, had become so routine that even the tools of erasure were prepared ahead of time. This was not cruelty born of impulse. It was cruelty absorbed into the very structure of record-keeping. The blank ledger is a machine standing ready, a bureaucratic skeleton awaiting flesh. Historians have debated what the emptiness means. Did the Henderson family abandon the farm before these lines could be filled? Did the deaths cease? Or did the record simply stop while the practice continued elsewhere? No evidence survives to answer. What survives is worse, the suspicion that the silence itself is deliberate, a final concealment, an act of erasure carried out not through words, but through the refusal to write. The horror of the blank pages lies not in what is present, but in what is missing. They suggest a continuity that stretches beyond the archive, as though the cycle of hire and void did not end with the Henderson, but extended outward into other farms, other ledgers that did not survive. The empty space invites names that can never be recovered, lives folded into the silence of history itself. To turn these pages is to confront the realization that history does not only record events, it can also participate in their disappearance. By leaving the lines empty, the Henderson ensured that the final act of violence was not the striking of a name, but the refusal to acknowledge it at all. The Henderson archive forces us to examine how institutions designed to protect the vulnerable can be corrupted to ensure their destruction. How respectability can serve as camouflage for systematic elimination. How silence can be purchased, maintained, and passed down through generations until it becomes indistinguishable from truth. The men who vanished into the Henderson farm were not statistics. They were William Murphy, who dreamed of earning enough to bring his family from Ireland; Michael O'Brien, who carried shrapnel in his leg from Gettysburg and sought only steady work to ease his pain; Patrick Kelly, barely 18, who wrote his first letter home from Delaware County before disappearing forever. Each name voided in those ledgers represented hopes cut short, families left wondering, lives reduced to administrative convenience. They were men whose only crime was vulnerability, whose only mistake was trusting a family that had weaponized their own reputation. The archive preserves their names not as memorial, but as evidence of a system that treated human beings as seasonal equipment to be used and discarded. What makes the Henderson story particularly chilling is its ordinariness. There were no dramatic confrontations, no obvious signs of evil, just a family that attended church, paid their taxes, and smiled at their neighbors, while methodically eliminating the men who worked their fields. The banality of their evil, hidden behind ledger books and false signatures, reveals how normalized such practices could become. The physical evidence uncovered decades later tells the rest of the story: bones bearing marks of blunt trauma, skulls fractured by deliberate violence, ribs showing evidence of systematic beatings. These men did not die from accidents or illness. They were murdered, their bodies hastily buried in mismarked graves while their killers continued to receive communion each Sunday. The corruption extended beyond the Henderson family themselves: sheriffs who accepted payment to look away, pastors who remained silent despite knowing the truth, county officials who misfiled reports and lost documentation. The archive reveals a web of complicity that reached into every level of local tertied, government and religious authority. This systematic corruption explains how the Henderson operated for years without consequence. They did not evade justice, they purchased it. They did not avoid scrutiny, they bought silence. The very institutions meant to protect society's most vulnerable members were transformed into instruments of their destruction. The newspaper clippings preserved alongside the death records reveal the final insult. While men died in Henderson fields, the local press celebrated the family's Christian charity. While bodies were buried under false names, church bulletins praised their moral character. The carefully cultivated image of respectability did not mask their crimes, it enabled them. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that this system was not unique to the Henderson farm. The same conditions that made their crimes possible existed throughout rural America in the decades following the Civil War. Vulnerable workers with no advocates, corrupt officials willing to be bought, communities that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The Henderson archive may be the only detailed record that survived, but it was almost certainly not the only such operation. How many other farms operated similar systems? How many other ledgers were burned before they could be discovered? How many other archives of murder were lost to time and deliberate destruction? The blank pages at the end of the Henderson ledgers suggest the most terrifying possibility of all, that the killing did not stop when the record stopped. That somewhere, other families continued the practice while being more careful about documentation. That the silence purchased by the Henderson may have protected not just their crimes, but an entire network of similar operations. In the end, the Henderson archive does not close with answers, but with questions that can never be fully resolved. The blank pages remind us that history is written not just by what we preserve, but by what we choose to forget. The Henderson family understood this truth and used it as a weapon. The story of the Henderson family is not just the story of one farm's crimes. It is the story of how systems meant to protect can be corrupted to destroy, how respectability can mask evil, how silence can be manufactured and maintained across generations. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how many other stories remain buried, how many other archives wait to be discovered, how many other blank pages conceal crimes we are not yet ready to confront. If this account unsettled you, subscribe to the Macabre Record so these buried histories are never lost again. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is as you hear this story. Because somewhere another archive waits, its blank pages still complicit in silence. This was the Henderson family, a forgotten archive of murdered farmhands. Until the next case, remember the most terrifying truths are not whispered legends. They are the records we were never meant to find.